Hello, I welcome you to the Psychology of Global Crises Conference, hosted by the American University of Paris. I am extremely thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mark Freeman. Mark Freeman is Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Society in the Department of Psychology at the College of the Holy Cross in the US. I am Maria Medved, Professor of Psychology at the American University of Paris and one of the co-organizers of this conference. I will be moderating this session. How do I introduce Mark Freeman in less than a minute? Well, I'd like to highlight three things. First, let's start with his scholarship. He's a prolific author of numerous path-breaking publications, such as Hindsight and Rewriting the Self. I remember reading this book just after obtaining my PhD and being stunned that psychologists were even allowed to have thoughts like this or do research like this. I was glad that I read it after my PhD and not before, or I may not have gotten my doctorate. Second, I would like to recognize his institutional efforts, along with others, to make sure that qualitative research has a place in psychology at all. And lastly, I would like to mention his editorship of Oxford University Press's series, Explorations in Narrative Psychology. That's making sure scholars have a place to publish their thinking, even if it goes beyond the mainstream. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Mark Freeman, giving his talk called The Allure of Narrative, Information, Misinformation, and Disinformation in the Time of Coronavirus.
Thank you, Maria. Wherever you are, whether it's morning, evening, or sometime midday, I wish you all good day. I hope you're safe and well. I want to begin today by thanking the organizers who've done an amazing job at putting this conference together. I also want to thank the many previous speakers I've heard, not only for their good words, but also because they've led me to craft a quite different talk than the one I've been planning to give. It's not a devil's advocate talk, that's not my style, but I do want to respond to a number of the ideas that have been generated so far, especially those that are hopeful, even optimistic about the positive consequences that may accrue in the wake of the pandemic. Before diving in, let me offer just a few thoughts to set the stage. First, a number of people have suggested, rightly, that catastrophic events of the sort we're seeing now can yield new forms of care and solidarity, even communitas, a coming together in the face of liminality, an intimate sharing of a sort that might not have been possible without the catastrophe at hand. Something like this emerged in the wake of 9/11 in the States, in Banda Aceh, Indonesia, following the tsunami that hit some years back, and many other similar events, or many other such events. In some of my own work, I've acknowledged this phenomenon under the rubric of the priority of the other, especially the person in need who calls forth my care. Now, it's possible that this centrifugal sense of caring and relational solidarity, this being called outward, beyond the self, beyond the ego, will be long lasting. It's possible that something has been revealed about our shared humanity, our shared interconnectedness, and that it'll have staying power. Eros, Freud called it the power of love, the power of binding people into larger wholes, families, communities, nations. This sort of wake-up call, as Hannah Maratoya referred to it yesterday, can happen on the personal plane too. In the face of a debilitating, dangerous disease, one may confront and even embrace one's own vulnerability and dependency and mortality and live differently. It's also possible that these sorts of revelations will lead us in psychology to theorize in new, more appropriately relational ways. I share these forms of hope with many of the people at this conference, and I, like them, see this moment as a real opportunity to think and live differently, otherwise, beyond the sovereign, seemingly self-sufficient self. I do have some worries about its staying power. And that's because there's often a kind of reversion backward after the initial rush, a centripetal return to what I've elsewhere referred to as the ordinary oblivion, the forgetfulness of everyday life. In this respect, I think we have both an opportunity and a challenge. The challenge of remembering, of keeping in view these different ways of thinking and living and being. Second, I also worry that the kind of solidarity some have spoken of isn't the only form of it. There are negative forms too, ones that are sometimes pitted against the positive ones, culminating in ugly forms of us-them thinking. I'll be speaking more about this later. One other thought for now that I want to offer cautiously. During the course of listening to some of the more hopeful, forward-looking talks that have been presented at the conference by Molly Andrews, Roger Free, Emil Lieblich, and others, it dawned on me that none of them were from the United States, where both the medical and especially the political situation remains, for the likes of me, truly horrifying. There are, of course, people who have a hopeful vision here too. But it's mainly among those who can afford to hope, so to speak, who have what might be called the luxury of hope. I don't mean this as a criticism of the vision, but I do think the nature and magnitude of hope is distributed unevenly, at least in the States, in line with extant class differences, inequalities, and so on. This isn't the reason not to hope, but it is a reason to continue to recognize the hopeless and despairing. There are many. So where do all these preliminary comments lead me? Well, they lead me to a somewhat more suspicious and fearful image of the future, and to a kind of vigilance regarding what's happening now and what might. Alongside Eros, Freud told us, is Thanatos, the power of death, of undoing and perhaps destroying what binds us together. This is a curious place for me to be. I usually land on the brighter, more upbeat side of things. In better moments, I'm still there. But at this particular moment, I find myself wanting to supplement the more positive visions that have been offered, and to present a kind of counterweight, one that returns us to the gravity and urgency of the current situation. In what follows, I want to chart three somewhat distinct phases of my own thinking about these issues. Phases that basically parallel what's been going on in the States since Donald Trump entered the picture. I don't want to talk about him much. For one, Dan McAdams, among others, can do, in fact, has done a much better, more thorough job of it. For another, I really don't want to give Trump undue attention. He's taken enough from us already, and I don't want to give him much more. So what are these phases? I'll call phase one the serious concerns phase. The first piece I did on these issues took the form of a lecture I gave at none other than the American University of Paris at the kind invitation of Brian Schiff, titled Whose Story, Whose World, Life and Narrative in the Age of Trump. I gave a talk about a month after Trump's inauguration, the one where he fantasized or hallucinated or simply lied about the massive crowd that had gathered to hear his incredible words. Here's a passage from that talk. We're experiencing what might be called narrative anxiety. A story is unfolding, that much is clear, but we don't know yet what it is. And that's very, very scary. Sometimes this story in the making seems to be one of a brash and bumbling narcissistic incompetent who's getting so frustrated by the relentless criticisms he himself is bringing upon himself that he's bound to implode and maybe just give up or do something so outlandish that he'll be impeached. Unfortunately, this seems unlikely to me, mainly because of his clear and obvious loathing of failure, coupled with his truly remarkable powers of fictional transformation. Somehow he was able to turn paltry crowds the day of inauguration into teeming masses, clamoring joyfully for their new leader. Now, rationally speaking, one might assume that he knew in his heart that it wasn't such a great showing and just did a little psychological maneuvering in order to reassure himself and his followers that the event was a rousing success. This would be a fairly standard psychodynamic narrative. A little denial, a little wishful thinking, and voila, a huge crowd. And maybe when he sat on the edge of his king-size bed that night, ready to crawl in with Melania, he had a moment of painful self-confrontation. Geez, that was kind of pathetic. More likely, though, that is, if he could admit that the turnout was a lot sparser than he'd wished, he'd be enraged and point to all the evil people in the media, especially, who drove away the crowds and thereby prevented him from gaining the glory that was rightfully his. This would be a fairly standard narrative, too. Frustrated with his poor, utterly unfair treatment, the victim rails against those hell-bent on destroying him. This one's a bit more plausible, mainly because of the narcissistic assault and rage angle. I hate them all, he might have said. I want them out. And then a solution. Let me get rid of who I can. That was 3 years ago. It wasn't long after I shared these words that Trump began addressing the so-called border crisis, the extrusion of the unwelcome other, serving as a particularly alluring storyline for those wishing to make America great again, pure, unsullied, white. And it also wasn't too long after that that there would be further exclusions and extrusions, essentially of anyone who threatened the narrative in the making by either criticizing him or speaking the truth. We might think of this as narrative cleansing, such that all the ugly stories of his incompetence and corruptness, along with all the people who told them, would be purged. This is still going on and has resulted in the dismissal of a number of people who dared to speak the truth. As an aside, it's interesting that many of those sympathetic to constructionist thinking have suddenly become realists. So far, I've been talking about Trump himself and the things he's done to sustain his image and storyline. But we shouldn't forget that it takes audiences, readers, to keep storylines alive. What's so strange and mystifying, at least to lots of the people I tend to hang with, is that the more Trump's absurdities and lies and horrors emerged, the more solidified his base became. Apparently, there was no room for complexity or multiplicity. Many people didn't seem to care about Trump the racist, or Trump the misogynist, or the many sordid tales that emerged. And even if they did care, they seem to have found it perilously easy to sweep it aside, to do some cleansing and purging of their own. These were people who were so disgusted with politics as usual, or so contemptuous of some of the players involved, that they seem to have been willing to give Trump a pass in the hope that this utterly different kind of character could bring some much needed change to politics and to their lives. There were also those whose support was born out of pure self-interest, whether political or economic or both. There were the hold your nose people who knew full well what was going on, but felt that they had to stay the course, whether in the hope that their meager coffers might get filled or that their already stuffed ones might get fuller. Some people, it should be noted, identified with Trump and still do. The intrepid iconoclast who tells it like it is, who's there for us, to undo all the niceties of politics as usual. Others felt disenfranchised or ignored. That at least was one of the leading narratives in the aftermath of the election. He's our guy, some of them said. In addition, as a friend of mine who read an initial draft of this talk reminded me, there were the one issue people, the people so committed to one issue: abortion, gun control, immigration, Israel, whatever. Everything else was incidental, a mere blip on the screen of their unswerving single-mindedness. All this is by way of saying that there was lots going on besides the allure of narrative, and it's important to acknowledge it. But I want to return to that allure. In that initial talk I gave, I went on to identify 3 distinct narrative dangers. The first, which fits scarily well with the one issue idea, is what I called narrative homogenization, the reduction of multiplicity into singularity. We saw this in full bloom in the crisis over the border, which on Trump's account portrays the immigrant border crosser as dangerous intruder lurking on our doorsteps, or as useless, skillless parasite or thief stealing from the natives. Lock the doors, put up fences, build walls. These 2 storylines, and there are others, are variations on the theme I spoke of earlier, the extrusion of the unwelcome other so as to preserve the purity and the primacy of the same. We've been seeing a variant of these storylines in how Trump and his minions have handled the latest unwelcome other, the coronavirus, which might be called the got it covered, it's all good narrative. It's no big deal, Trump said at the beginning. On January 22nd, there was 1 confirmed case in the States. We do have a plan, Trump said, and we think it's going to be handled very well. We've already handled it very well. So no worries. January 2nd, a 2nd case was confirmed. A week later, there were 5. Eventually, as you know, the World Health Organization declared coronavirus a public health emergency. But to all the alarmists still out there, he effectively said, relax. And he did say, we think we have it very well under control. We have very little problem in this country at this moment, 5. And those people are all recuperating successfully. So, quote again, we think it's going to have a very good ending for us. That I can assure you. The protector, the reassurer. Leaping ahead to February 26th, he said, you have 15 people. And the 15, within a couple of days, is going to be down to close to 0. End quote. This might be called the whew, or close call narrative. Thank goodness that's out of the way. Between then and now, Trump would actually say, quote, we have met the moment and we have prevailed. War language, as Hannah Maratoya pointed out, lots of it. That was the day the death toll in the States passed 80,000. Quote, we will transition into greatness, he would eventually add. That's a phrase you're going to hear a lot, he said. I'm sure he's right about that. Narrative homogenization revisited, even in the face of the indisputable facts pointing in the direction of other, more truthful narratives entirely. As many experts have said, the facts suggest that the administration's response to the coronavirus has been a disaster and has involved insufficient testing, failure to send needed medical gear to healthcare workers, cutting off funding to the World Health Organization, firing experts who have sought to speak the truth, spreading of bizarre misinformation, along with some flat out lies, most of which have either blamed others for what's going on or called for gratitude and appreciation in light of the great good that's been done. It's profoundly painful for many of us. Every single day. It's also monumentally absurd. at least to those of us who think it's monumentally absurd. And again, what's astounding and mystifying is that Trump and his obsequious imprinting style ducklings in Congress especially can do all of this stuff, and his approval rating continues to approach 50%. I want to try to understand it. I don't want to get too self-righteous about all this and just express my puzzlement and horror about 100 million or so people in the States. Nor do I want to just move into contempt mode, tempting though that often is. A quick story in this context. Every now and then I'll rail against somebody who does something asinine, in traffic, for instance, or at the grocery store, and say something like, must be a Trumper, or it's probably a friend of Mitch McConnell, whatever. One of our daughters, who knows and quite likes some card-carrying Trumpers, is quick to offer a kind of rebuke of such crude stereotyped images of who these people are. Most of the people I know are good people, she might say. They just have different views about things than you do. So chill out, you arrogant lefty, she's essentially saying, and have some respect for people who are different than you. I think that what she has to say in this context is admirable. It's certainly more charitable. While I'm ready to either explode in rage or implode in despair, she, with her live and let live stance, continues to welcome the stranger, so to speak, into her midst. She's not a big fan of Trump, mind you. His mind-bogglingly inane coronavirus performances, among other things, have left her nearly as critical of him as we are. She just won't go there with his supporters, at least not in the blanket way I and others sometimes do. Good for her, I guess. But I still want to know, how's it possible? It's not just a matter of different views. For some, it appears to be a flagrant denial of reality, or less severely, but no less problematically, a flagrant disregard for it, a condition of being so ensconced in an ideological position as to effectively say, I don't care about reality. I'm willing to go with the narrative no matter what. Molly Andrews also mentioned resistance to reality, resistance to knowing, willed ignorance, as Primo Levi has called it. There's also the fetishization of individualism and freedom, manifested, for instance, in some of the recent, sometimes heavily armed protests about opening back up. So I don't want to oversimplify things, but I still do want to know, how is all this possible? How is it possible for misinformation and disinformation to nullify real information grounded in some semblance of reality? Alongside the idea of narrative homogenization, I had also put forth the related idea of narrative apocalypticism, which referred to the kind of totalizing narrative that entailed the destruction of the established order and its replacement by a new one, a greater one that promised an unprecedented opportunity for redemption and salvation. Some of you may recall some of the now infamous words uttered at Trump's inauguration speech when he referred to, quote, mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of knowledge, and the crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. The American carnage stops right here and stops right now, he said. And I, of course, he was suggesting, am the one to make it happen. As for what was going on beyond our own borders, which were also going to take on, quote, radical Islamic terrorism, which he said we will eradicate from the face of the earth, end quote. Now, one of the things that's extra dangerous about these sorts of storylines, whether it's about the carnage here or the threat of carnage coming from without, is that there are elements that are bound to strike even skeptical readers as at least partially valid. In the first storyline, he's giving us images that bear within them some measure of truth. Mothers and children trapped in poverty, substandard education, gang violence, and so on. And he's having them stand for the larger story, the story. In the second, similarly, he's calling back images from 9/11 and all the stories that derived from it, often in cinematic form, and having them signify all of the other invaders the world over, ready to attack, to defile, alluring in a way, and extremely dangerous. I am here to protect you. I am here to save you. And God sent me to do it. Now, Trump himself didn't utter these words, not explicitly anyway. But I don't think it's stretching things to say that the narrative of the Savior here to redeem the world, or at least the part he likes, was front and center throughout much of the campaign and has been since. Along these lines, there's no question in my mind, but that for many, Trump's appeal is a religious one, tied to purification and salvation. He knew how to tell that story, and in true messianic fashion, he gathered a big and devoted flock along the way, including, but by no means limited to, those evangelicals who, out of their deep religious fervor, are willing to follow his lead. And it's still happening. Apocalypticism. As for the third danger I'd identified, finally, I call it narrative solipsism. And here I was referring to, and I quote once again, the kind of dynamic wherein narrative loses its foothold in the real and becomes hermetically self-enclosed, such that one comes to live in a story world of one's own making. That Donald Trump may be in the process of living in such a world is troubling in its own right. That others, many others, seem to be joining him renders the situation nothing short of explosive. With these preliminary ideas in mind, let me offer a thesis of sorts. When the relationship of narrative to reality is severed, we run the risk of falling prey to tyranny, the totalizing story being but a short step from totalitarianism. Suffice it to say, 3 years later, this concern remains. In fact, it's much more pronounced now and much more troubling than it was then. So that's where I was a few years back. Now, I'm not suggesting that I was somehow prophetic in uttering these words. Some of what I was seeing at the time was as clear as day, and plenty of others saw it. But little did I know just how bad and how scary things would get. So let's call this second phase the downright scary phase. Consider for a moment some ideas put forth by Michiko Kakutani in her book, The Death of Truth, Notes on Falsehood in the Age of Trump. After drawing some connections between Trump and certain strands of Bolshevism, Nazism, and so on, she goes on to suggest a connection between Trump and Putin, the latter's model of propaganda having been deemed the fire hose of falsehood, an unremitting high-intensity stream of lies, partial truths, and complete fictions spewed forth with tireless aggression to obfuscate the truth and overwhelm and confuse anyone trying to pay attention. End quote. Trump has made use of much of the same strategy, resulting in the cacophony and confusion that Brian Schiff and others spoke about. To quote Kakutani again, the sheer volume of desinformatia unleashed by the Russian fire hose system, much like the more improvised but equally voluminous stream of lies, scandals, and shocks emitted by Trump, his GOP enablers, and media apparatchiks, tends to overwhelm and numb people while simultaneously defining deviancy down and normalizing the unacceptable. Outrage gives way to outrage fatigue, which gives way to the sort of cynicism and weariness that empowers those disseminating the lies, end quote. Alongside the cacophony and the resultant confusion, there may be and often is, here at least in the States, a shutting out or a shutting off, a reclusive sense of despair. Some stop watching the news. Some turn to other things. Long walks outside, bicycling, bourbon. Occasionally we're roused from this confusion and exhaustion and see a ray of light. This time, we sometimes say, in the face of the latest instance of corruption, this time is going to do it. People are going to wake up and see reality. Finally, the breaking point. Well, this times have happened repeatedly. And narrative is partly to blame. As CNN's Brian Stelter has argued, President Trump is winning the storytelling game with help from his friends in the media. Watch enough of his rallies and his power as a storyteller shines through. He's the hero, the savior, the dragon slayer of his own story. The villains include Democrats, foreigners, and the journalists in the back of the hall. Love him or hate him, but give credit where it's due, Trump is succeeding at telling the story. Trump's stories are often more fiction than fact, but the thing about a story, like a novel or a drama, Stelter says, is that it's not really meant to be fact-checked. The narrative is meant to make you feel, end quote. The apocalypticism idea is relevant here too. It's us versus them, Stelter writes, darkness versus light. His lies are legendary, but many of them, quote, are in the service of the grand story he's telling. Look past the lies for a moment and you can see why his crowds love it. He says he's putting America first, fixing the economy, fighting the dark forces trying to stop him. His story is about wall building and swamp draining and deep state defeating. And he is the hero, while the pro-Trump media act as his co-producers. In Hollywood terms, it's as if Trump has a well-stocked writer's room where loyalists develop the plot lines for the next episodes, end quote. This brings me back to that little story I told about our daughter. Earlier this year at the biannual Psychology and the Other conference, I attended a session titled Fascist Experience in a Traumatized World, the embodiment of us and them. Fascist experience. And it wasn't just addressing Trump, nor was it just addressing his followers. Rather, it was addressing all of us. At its foundation were two fundamental premises. First, no charismatic leader could mobilize the masses without their readiness. And second, we all contain elements of fascism, psychologically conceived, within us, and it's embodied most visibly in the us-them dynamic. This may be stretching the idea of fascism a bit too far, but it's provocative nonetheless and worth thinking about. Returning to the current situation, it's another piece of the narrative puzzle, I think, and it's being masterfully and cruelly employed by Trump through blaming, scapegoating, and demonizing, again, the feared and dreaded other. Immigrants, Democrats, scientists, inspectors general, Obama, China, all of whom are seen in one way or another to pose a threat, one thought to diminish and undermine one's own place in the world. Them, they did it. This part of the picture is probably familiar to many of you. But what also happens, and what may be somewhat less familiar, is that we who are constituted as the them become reified into another us, such that they become demonized, blanketed by our own modes of othering, which, I hate to admit, can be as narratively resistant and recalcitrant as the stuff we might deplore. I'm not about to get all lovey-dovey about this. I can't. The issues go too deep. Instead, I want to think about all this more carefully and candidly, and if possible, compassionately, in the hope that it might ultimately lead me and others of my kind, as well as them, somewhere beyond the despair and hostility and rage we, capital W, often feel. In any case, this second phase, the downright scary phase, was a very tough one. And then there was the emergence of the coronavirus. This phase is the one we're in now. Let's call it the narrative anxiety redoubled phase. Lots of people in the States were anxious well before COVID-19 hit. Narrative anxiety, you recall, was something I mentioned earlier in conjunction with the talk I gave at a UP a few years back. This anxiety and fear has continued apace over the past 3 years, gaining strength all the while. How will it all play out? Many have wondered. What does the future hold for us and for democracy? There were lots of other things happening across the globe that added to this anxiety. Politically, technologically, environmentally, and more. Leading for many to a kind of existential anxiety born out of the sheer relentlessness of things. In some ways, I'm talking here about the anxiety of narrative itself, the anxiety of not knowing the plot or the ending of the story in the making being lived. So it is that history, Paul Ricoeur wrote back in 1971, may appear as a play, but with players who don't know the plot. To a greater or lesser extent, of course, it's always this way. There's a very real sense in which we never quite know what's going on until later, in hindsight. This is the ordinary anxiety of everyday life in its indeterminacy and uncertainty and open-endedness. And it was certainly magnified by all the nonsense that's been going on for the past 3 years. Good God, many people said, what's next? Well, now we know. The coronavirus. And with it, we have a number of new forms or modes of anxiety tied to new dimensions of indeterminacy and uncertainty. There's the anxiety of the virus itself. How bad is it? Am I going to get it? If I do, will I be asymptomatic, or will I be lying in bed hooked up to a ventilator without family or friends? Will the virus mutate? Will there be a vaccine? So forth and so on. There's the anxiety that's a function of the bizarre stew of information, misinformation, and disinformation, and of not knowing the distribution of the three. Who do I believe? Who can I believe? And how is it possible, given what we do know, that some people, again, are flagrantly disregarding this knowledge? Do they really think they're invulnerable, or that this is some hoax perpetrated by the deep state? There's the anxiety, in addition, of knowing, or at least suspecting, that other people are controlling and manipulating the narrative without our quite knowing how or toward what end. And not least, there's the anxiety and fear of mortality, of death. So we're talking here about a multifaceted, multidimensional anxiety, a veritable perfect storm of anxiety, felt in varying degrees on the part of individuals, but lived in one way or another by all, even if on an unconscious plane. Along with a sense of vulnerability, fragility, and loss for many, the grieving of our assumptions, as Roger Free put it. And I would add the grieving of the life that existed before, and of course, the grieving of the dead. The potentially positive side of this situation, Roger went on to say, is the possibility of people acknowledging and accepting their vulnerability, perhaps leading to a kind of softening of selfhood, especially in its more hyper-agentic, individualized forms. Jens Brockmeyer talked about this too on a more theoretical and disciplinary level in an interesting and compelling way when he called for new, more decentered forms of theorizing the self. Jeff Reber's discussion of how the current crisis might serve to cast long-standing assumptions about human nature into question is relevant here too. And Wade Pickerin's talk just before this one also had some things to say about the reimagination of theory. But of course, the consequences at hand aren't all positive. Yes, there may be post-traumatic growth for some. There may be moral and spiritual deepening too. It's important to know this, to be sure. But there can also be quite severe negative consequences. And for those who have or had mental health difficulties before the virus hit, the consequences for them might be that much more severe and that much more disabling. Maria Medved's talk did well to address this issue and much more in her talk. Scary. And again, extremely dangerous. The reason I think is that this state of multifaceted and multidimensional anxiety and fear that we're witnessing has created a vacuum, a vulnerability vacuum, as we might call it, which often has as its correlate a receptivity and a susceptibility to those narratives, whether real or fictional, that promise some measure of deliverance from this very anxiety and fear. Trump and his cronies seek to tap into all of this and are in the process of doing exactly that. They're engaged in a kind of psychological surveillance in a way, seeing what veins of anxiety they can tap so as to bring more followers on board. There's no better way to do this, it seems, than to offer up the promise not only of control, but power and domination and liberation from those who threaten them and their way of life, even if it means violence. Are you hurting? Aren't you hurting? Trump might ask. Do you want to lose your livelihood or your manhood? And aren't you getting frustrated by being locked up like a caged animal, all in the name of some allegedly pernicious threat that may not even be one? Time to get back to it. Liberate, Trump told those gun and rifle toting protesters who felt their cherished freedom was being undermined by being responsible to others. Regain control, agency, pride. Quote, "We will transition into greatness," Trump said recently. But that can only happen, he implied, if you're freed from your cages. This means seeking and recruiting, sucking into the aforementioned vulnerability vacuum, all of those wayward, rudderless souls out there, many of them feeling shame and desperate to regain a sense of power and potency. It also means pitting people against one another and giving would-be zealots images and symbols that might serve to flame their fear and indignation and resentment of all who might interfere with their livelihood or their well-being. Don't blame me, Trump has said. I did nothing wrong. So, essentially, take all that hot emotion and project it onto others. I'll tell you who they are. Sprinkle it with absurd conspiracy theories. more demonization, projective demonization, more othering. If you don't join the team, the great American dream will go down the drain and you with it. It's an alluring narrative to many, and it's powerful, and it's no doubt endangering their health and even perhaps their very survival. That's happening now. Consider a message I saw this morning, a headline. Health officials warn weekend revelers of tragic impact. It's an awful situation. The last thing anyone would want would be for this sort of thing to happen. This is no time for I told you so's or now what do you think of your freedom? Let's not go there. It's immoral and wrong. But the fact is, the statistics, terrible and terrifying as they are, haven't seemed to really take for a lot of people. They're too abstract. They're too unfathomable. So here's another thought. It's a tragic one that brings us back to narrative and its allure and disturbing in its own right. In regard to the immigrant situation I referred to earlier, there seemed to be nothing that could budge people from the invasion and fear narrative until they heard stories or saw images of children crying and sometimes dying in the hot sand and dirt of Texas or Arizona. Well, it may be that the only way to counter the triumphalist Trump-inspired narrative of prevailing over the pandemic, with its images of returning to life as we knew it, with our crowded restaurants and bars and football games, it may be that the only way to counter that is by its inverted image. Not unlike the images of those crying and dying children, that means images and stories of despair and death. The faces, as Emmanuel Levinas might put it, of real others, of flesh and blood people that might be powerful enough to break through the crust of ideology or fantasy of willed ignorance, that can call us out of ourselves, that demand our attention and care. This is a horrible thought, truly. I hope and pray we don't get to that point. In fact, I hope I'm wrong about the picture I've been painting here. But the fact is, we in the States are witnessing a narrative about making America great again that is so ideologically rooted and so consistently and ruthlessly fueled by a barrage of information, misinformation, and disinformation that it seems utterly immovable, utterly resistant to any new episode of vileness or stupidity or mendacity that might, in some other world, change the course of things. As I've suggested repeatedly, it's very scary and very dangerous. That the coronavirus is a global crisis has become a truism. But it might also be suggested, cautiously, of course, that the more dangerous pandemic may be found in those various movements in the United States and elsewhere that involve the full-on spread of misinformation and disinformation, and in turn, the full-scale misshaping and corruption and derealization of reality itself. A narrative pandemic, as it were. And there's no vaccine for it. Not now, not ever. So where does all this lead us? Well, since I seem to be working in threes today, I'll offer one last trio of ideas in closing. A triple hermeneutic. First, in line with the more positive pictures that have been painted by others, there's the need for a hermeneutics of hope, or a kind of faith. This hope is not only for individual flourishing, but also for the larger, more macro societal restructuring and environmental repair that are so sorely needed in the States and elsewhere. Many people at this conference has made a compelling case for this. Second, there's the need for a hermeneutics of vigilance or suspicion, critique, one that remains attuned to the allure of narrative and more generally the instrumental machinations and diversionary tactics of those who would privilege their own political ends over the health and well-being of suffering and oppressed people. I mean this in relation both to the current pandemic and the larger one I just referred to. Third, and finally, there's a need for a hermeneutics of compassion, oriented not only toward the suffering and oppressed people I just mentioned, but also towards those others, those thems we might despise. Ideally, this would lead not to the much vaunted return to normal many seek. That normal wasn't so great for a lot of people. Instead, it would lead to a new, more capacious solidarity, one that would welcome the stranger, even the feared or dreaded or even despised other, into its midst. Easier said than done, I know. And truthfully, I don't think I'll be able to do it with Trump or McConnell, ever. But without this hermeneutic of compassion, without some image of shared humanity or the possibility of it, we will surely be led into still more troubled waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this profound keynote, Mark. I really appreciated your passion and the passionate way that you told it. I heard it really as a call to action for the three hermeneutics of our, the trio of hope, vigilance, and compassion. And I also heard it as a narrative of emotion, of feeling, and a call to feel rather than to intellectualize and to talk about this as if it's at a distance, and to really ignite the emotional parts of us. So I want to thank you for that. And just before I continue, I'd like to remind the listeners to please use the question and answer box if you have any comments or questions for Mark. I'm sure he'd be most pleased to take them up. Well, Mark, you've just covered such a wide range of topics, from narrative strategies to religion, to fascism, to really everywhere. And you kind of presented it as 3 stages. So the anxious stage and or phases.
Yeah.
It's almost a narrative as well. Now, you said that you didn't know where the narrative would go. They almost struck me as chapters.
Right.
Given your knowledge of religion and history and so on, is there a next chapter? How do you see that playing out?
That's a great and very, very important question, obviously. I think much of it is going to depend on the election.
Yeah.
I mean, even before that, much of it is going to depend on the pandemic. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it's a kind of monumental moment. And even though we're now seeing some signs that, you know, it's abating or that it's getting under control, we just don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And we don't know what spread of information, misinformation, and disinformation is going to emerge in the wake of it. But as I say, for those of us in the States, the election is extraordinarily important. If in fact someone besides Trump is elected, I don't know whether I'll say that it bodes well for the American future and for world future, but at least it will present a kind of possibility and a sense of openness and potential. If, on the other hand, Trump is elected, and I'm certainly not speaking for all Americans here, only some, I think that's going to lead to real horror and real fear. Because there won't be an election looming again that might serve as a check on whatever authoritarian impulses he has. And people have already begun talking about this. You know, my word, what would it be like if he's in again? What will it be like, not only for Congress, and what will it be like for democracy, for the climate, for world relations, and so on? And, you know, I know I get jazzed by this stuff. You can tell by my talk, but I think it's big. I think it's big. And I'd be lying to you if I didn't say I have real fear about the future. And, you know, I don't want to make those of us in the States seem unique, because people are suffering all over the world. But it's overlaid here with the political stuff, which is relentless. It's relentless. So
I'm gonna, since I'm the moderator, I'm gonna like just ask one more question, and then I'll go to some of the questions. You kind of ended on your note about the power of the image. And, you know, I think many of us have noted there is a real lack of imagery around the virus. There's, you know, partially because photographers, it's hard for them to get into hospitals. So, you know, maybe you could just talk about how you're thinking about that, because it sounds like almost the power of narrative, at least linguistically, maybe isn't quite enough to get at that affective part. And I'm just wondering how you're thinking about the power of, or the narrative of image even.
Yeah. I won't pretend to have well-developed thoughts about this. In the talk I gave last year in Turku, I tried to elaborate on the idea, suggesting that it may actually be through art, or at least through more artful approaches to the problem at hand, that we can approach that level of feeling and perhaps activate people in a way that statistics and journalism and so forth don't. I mean, what do those numbers mean? 50,000, 80,000, almost 100,000. What do they mean? Yes, in a kind of intellectualized way, we can look at what's happening and the curves and all that, and we can formulate a judgment about it. That's awful. But it's not leading us to develop the kind of passion and compassion that I think holds within it the potential for people to move forward. So, you know, I don't know exactly where that can go. I mean, I think it's going to be real important for writers to get in the game, and many of them already have gotten in the game. And not only nonfiction writers, but fiction writers. I think it's going to be important. It already is important for artists to get into the game. You know, filmmakers, painters, musicians, and so on. And, you know, I don't want to go too far in that direction, but I do want to consider it. And you're right to underscore the importance of feeling. I think a lot of what has been experienced has been, in a sense, de-emotionalized, one might say. And I think that makes compassion more difficult. So, you know, there's no simple solution to this, and it would be foolish for me to suggest there is. But those images of suffering, you know, there was one image in particular when it came to the immigrant situation. It was a very young child dead by the side of a river that, you know, sort of went viral. Why? Now, it's gruesome and weird to say maybe that kind of image could do something similar.
Yeah.
But I wonder. I called it what is it that might conceivably cut through the crust of numbness and unreality and generate the compassion that might actually allow for more hope than I currently am able to muster.
Great answer. It just kind of leads actually to a comment or question that Molly sent in, since we're talking about emotion here. It's going around. Isn't there an important role for anger in this current situation? Is hope for the future also predicated upon a realistic appraisal of how we have gotten to where we are?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely a place for anger in this. So I mean, truthfully, I hope people hearing this felt some of that. You know, it's not unusual for people, again, at least the people I hang with, to just be enraged at some of what you see. And that being enraged is also fueled by a sense of our own impotence.
Yeah.
Because enraged as we may be, all of the protests and words of wisdom from smart and compassionate people, they just haven't changed things very much. And so, yeah, I absolutely think there's an important place for anger. And again, Molly, I'll say this to you, I don't want to separate that out from hope. I mean, oftentimes it's anger that can provide the fuel for the kind of change that's needed. And yet, I don't want to remain perpetually in anger mode, because it's disabling in its own right. And important though it is, I think it's equally important in some ways to cultivate other ways of being in the world and other ways of being in relation to others. And so, is the anger there? Yeah. But I don't want it to dominate my life or the lives of people I know and care about.
Okay, Jens has sent in a question as well. Could it be that the sense of anxiety and vulnerability that you explored in your talk so sensitively might be, after all, the more adequate, appropriate, the more authentic reaction to those crises we are dealing with? Could it be that it corresponds more profoundly to what we would call, with Levinas, whom you quoted, the face in crisis?
Yeah. I agree completely. I mean, I see this as having been at the core of Roger Free's talk. And on some level, it permeated some of what you had to say, Jens, as well. I mean, the realization and acknowledgement of vulnerability, of mortality, even the embrace of those in a way, at least the vulnerability. You know, I think that represents a bona fide deepening and expansion of human reality. And so there is a good moment, or potentially good moment, I should say. I mean, let's not forget that some of the anxiety, and Maria knows this very well, and the grief and the fear and the dread can be utterly disabling for some people. But for others, it's allowed them to take stock, to establish more of a sense of their own priorities, to accept their own finitude, to love the people they love more, or maybe more explicitly than they sometimes do. So yeah, but what I worry about is the vulnerability vacuum. Yeah. Vulnerability vacuum. And I might be wrong about this, at least partially, but I do see some of it already. I mean, I don't think it's stretching things to say that there will be people who will capitalize on that vulnerability and that uncertainty and that desire for some sense of control and power and I think people are going to manipulate that. These are, it's easy prey in a way, right? Maybe it won't happen, or maybe it won't happen to the degree that I imagine it could. But given the way especially Trump has acted so far, we cannot and should not disregard it. Can't disregard it. You know, some people have said that the pandemic, you know, has knocked Trump's possibilities down because people are starting to see how problematic it is and that it's a disaster and so on. But, and this is a narrative dimension too, if things keep getting better and better, and if more people are coming on board because they think that this narrative of winning is actually being instantiated and enacted, you know it's going to happen. You know it's going to happen. So I'm much more cynical about some of this stuff than I tend to be. You know, in a lot of my recent work, I talk in a much more hopeful way, but it's just really hard. It's hard to do, I find.
Yeah. Roger sends in a few lines, so I'm going to read them here. A beautiful talk, Mark. Thank you so much. The fact that our experience of coronavirus is and can be unspeakably miserable is beyond question, just what you were just saying, Mark. As you point out, Mark, there are countries that are governed by social democracies, and there are countries that are clearly struggling democracies. How might a struggling democracy find a way to persevere given the lack of solidarity and the deep divides? How might our experience as individuals and as a society come to bear on our potential response, a proactive response to the misery? How might we persevere?
Gee, thanks, Roger. I mean, I think one of the most important things to happen here in the States, at least, is for us to regain some sense of relatedness and responsibility to and care for people in other countries. And it's not as if what we're doing is completely devoid of that. But if we think about what's been said about NATO or the World Health Organization, or just look toward the kind of nationalism that we see, it's not going to be looking outward, and it's not going to be coming to the aid of those struggling democracies for whom our own compassion and care and action might be very, very helpful. And so, you know, I don't know how that can change within struggling democracies themselves. And I'm not sure exactly which ones you're talking about or whether I'd even be able to address the ones you're talking about. But ultimately, it brings me back to the third hermeneutic, the hermeneutic of compassion. This is a global crisis. And what happens in the States or in France or in the UK or whatever, it resonates, right? I mean, the coronavirus began as a germ, you know? One person had it at one point, and it spread, you know? And I don't know that compassion can spread in the same way. You know, that would be a little too idealistic. But I think without a kind of looking outward, and not only to other people in other countries and struggling democracies and so forth, but as Wade and others have pointed out, to the environment, especially to the world. I mean, we need to have compassion for that too. You know, we don't want to be too androcentric about all of this. And I probably should have said something about that in the talk. But it's a great question. It's an important question, Roger.
Okay, so we have a question from Michelle Ferrari. I felt a profound sadness in your voice and presentation that I share, even living in Canada. We are in a unique position of being very close to events with almost an integrated economy, but not the same pull for Trump and the broader US narrative. I read his popularity here as something like 14%, redefining negative polling in this country, Canada. So question is, why does this narrative have such an appeal to the US but not elsewhere? And can you imagine something like what James asked for, a moral equivalent of war that can offer an equally compelling narrative of compassion, something like the Buddhist one maybe?
Can I imagine it? Sure. Can it be enacted in some efficient way? That's not clear to me. I think what's happening in the States is inseparable from what I would call its deep history. Its deep history. The way it was formed, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of the decimation of Native Americans. You know, there's the narrative of the pioneer and the narrative of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and being able to prevail. And, you know, there's a certain sense in which I think the idea of the individual is kind of hyperextended in the United States, and it's exacerbated by the kind of economy that we have and what happens on Wall Street, and so on. But the other thing that's happened is that elements of what I've called in some other work the narrative unconscious have bubbled to the top, right? I saw a question somebody was asking about, you know, what was happening before Trump assumed office and what was there. And my sense is that there was a lot there before, but that it was dormant. It was dormant. And what happened was, and this happened in race relations, is that the lid got taken off. And so certain impulses, American impulses, one might say, that had been laying dormant, suddenly got air. They got some oxygen. And, you know, with that, I think you're seeing increasing racist acts, you're seeing anti-Semitic acts and all the rest. Trump has probably created some of that, but he's also called it forth. Because as I said, you know, unless the masses are willing in some way, unless there's something in them, in their deep history, a history they may not even be able to articulate. That's why I call it the narrative unconscious. The narrative unconscious is about those aspects of our history and our formation as cultural and historical subjects about which we are largely unconscious. And I think it gets revealed, or can get revealed, in circumstances like the present one. So can I imagine a narrative that would somehow be able to, I don't know that I want to use the word compete with the prevailing one. If there's a fault of those who are trying to challenge Trump, it's that, and I'm not saying the only narrative should be a political one, is that there has yet to emerge one that has the taking power, the narrative power that he was able to generate with Make America Great Again. Right. What is there? You know, a call for compassion, it's yeah, I can offer that. How does that translate into a platform, a program? How does that work? And I would also ask, what role might we as psychologists have to play in that? Is it possible for us, especially those of us who are interested in narrative, to think of counter narratives. I mean, in that talk in Turku that I gave, I said the best way to fight this narrative is with narrative, and maybe narrative that has the kind of images that we spoke of earlier. But I'm not sure at this juncture what that narrative is. I can see its contours, and I think many people can, but we've yet to articulate it in a way that I think is compelling enough to break through the crust that I spoke about before.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Tomo, I hope that Mark just answered your question as well, referring to the historical aspects that are already inherent in the history. I hope it's okay with you, Mark, but I'd like to ask one or two long doozy questions because they've been waiting patiently. So I'm going to take the liberty. So this is from Carmen. Thank you so much for this highly rich talk. I have a question about what I see as your optimism-pessimism dichotomy that runs through your talk. I was wondering whether you could make use of what you described as the vulnerability vacuum and turn uncertainty into some form of middle ground between hope and tragedy. Habermas, who is not well known for existential thoughts, recently said that we have never had so much knowledge about our non-knowledge, and that the necessity to act and live in conditions of uncertainty. Is there a way to also think about the hermeneutics of fabulism and a political leader or hero who is also able to be fallible and admit mistakes? What do you mean by, it's a long one.
Yeah.
What do you mean by hermeneutics, and how does it relate to feeling? Trump knows how to produce narratives that make people feel like they regain control, but not how to live with uncertainty. Right. What do you see as the role of narrative?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have used the word hermeneutics. I'm basically talking about a kind of interpretive stance or worldview that would allow for the realization or the enactment of hope and vigilance and compassion. So you can set aside the word if it's too long. I think what's at the core of your question is that idea of a middle ground. And yeah, there's some sense in which I did slip into, if not a binary, a kind of duality. Hope on the one side and fear and dread on the other. And it's partly because I've been living that duality, as have many people. And so you're right. What's going to be needed eventually is neither a vision of the future that somehow covers over the real destruction that's gone on to democracy, to people, and so on. And at the same time, we don't want somebody who is so cathected to that damage that people are left either despondent or experience further impotence. And so the notion that there might be a middle ground wherein one can occupy not knowing, indeterminacy, uncertainty, I'm with you 100%. The word humility has gotten used a number of times at this conference, and I think a good and appropriate way. In a lot of ways, we've all been taken down to size. Although there were plenty of people who have been taken down to size before this happened, so let's not forget that. And that indeterminacy, the indeterminacy that we feel now and the not knowing that we feel now, it's an exaggerated form of something that is with us always, but that we often cover over or defend against with our knowledge and our technology and our science and all the rest. And so, yeah, I was also reminded of the title of a book from long ago by Gabrielle Marcel called Tragic Wisdom. And Marcel was a good thinker to kind of hold those things together. The tragedy is real, and the wisdom is real, or the hope is real. So maybe we need some kind of language that can fuse these ideas in a way that's less dualizing or something like that.
Okay, I think
Thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. And I'd like to thank Caroline for helping moderate the questions. And thank you so much, Mark, for a deeply moving, profound talk.
Thank you, Maria, for moderating it. And again, all the organizers. And thanks to all of you who participated. I heard some names I knew and some that I didn't. And I'm glad you were all able to stick with it. And I thank you for that.
Just to let everyone know, we can continue the conversation on Slack on Mark's channel, if you'd like. Okay, thank you so much, Mark.
I have a channel.
You do, you have a channel. Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.